All right, great. Well, let's start our session. I hope you can all hear me all right. I'm Dr. Francesco Belcastro, and I'm very glad to chair this session on Palestine and Israel, entitled Palestine, Israel and Changing Regional Dynamics. I won't take too much time with introductions because we have 4 panelists, and it's I want to leave as much time as possible to them. I do, however, need to say a couple of things. So the panelists will speak for about 15 minutes each. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box that you see just under your screen on your Zoom page, and we will then read them at the end. I'll ask my panelists to please keep to the 15 minutes as this way we have enough time for Q&A afterwards. Let me introduce them, and I want to say just one thing. We had so many good submissions on this particular topic of Israel and Palestine. It was very hard to choose the papers, so I'm very glad to have this particular panel. Our first speakers today are Dr. Sharri Plonski from Queen Mary University, London. The title of the presentation is Global Logistics and Israel Tracks for Regional Peace, the International Relations of a Corridor in the Making. Second speaker is Dr. Jan Wilkens, University of Hamburg, and its title is The Power of Scales, Changing Global Imaginations of Israel and Palestine Through Local Politics. Our third speaker is Abdulaziz Alghashian, University of Essex, and his title is better, How Close is Too Close, Saudi-Israeli Passive Cooperation. And then finally, Javier Guirado Alonso, Georgia State University, Surveilling Rawabi, Urban Regimes and the Reconfiguration of Israeli-Khaliji Relations. So we have a very interesting variety of topics, and I'm sure it's going to be a very good panel. So we'll follow the order. So I will, it's all stuck here. I will mute myself and to you, Sharri.
Okay, hi. Can everyone see the screen? Is it all working? Yeah. I won't be able to hear or see anyone, so I'm assuming everything is fine. And I wanted to really thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be part of this, and I'm really looking forward to the conversations we're going to have throughout this panel, and then with the Q&A and afterwards. So I'm going to kind of try to do this as a story, and I apologize, the first time I'm doing a Zoom presentation, so wish me luck. So in 2016, I started investigating a train line. In November of that year, this train, the Ha'emek Railway, was relaunched after a 65-year hiatus. It is 60 kilometers long, has 9 stops, and takes 45 minutes to travel from end to end. It basically starts at Israel's largest port city, Haifa, and stops suddenly in Beit She'an, just inside the northern Jordanian border. This seemingly innocuous train line connects a series of villages in Israel's central periphery region, which most likely few people outside the country have ever heard of, was built without directly displacing any Palestinian communities, has no onward connections beyond the Jordanian border, and I think most importantly seems completely distant from and is always overshadowed by much more clear and obvious acts of violence that Israel enacts in the West Bank and Gaza. And yet, this literal train to nowhere is in the process of being reimagined and reconfigured by Israel, as well as several others, as a key transport and trade corridor, essential to securing the continued undisruptive movements of global capitalism in the Middle East. In other words, as a train to everywhere. And so in my paper today, I'm arguing that it's worth paying attention to this train, or rather to the different logics and material relations that are operating through it and around it, to smooth out and hide its really deep entanglements in these direct acts of violence that we already recognize, like in walls, soldiers, and settlers, that strangle lives in spaces deemed dangerous and threatening to racial and capitalist modes of governance in Israel, but also globally. Because as you'll see, this is very much a global project. And in fact, draws us into thinking about the train, as well as Israel, as harnessing a global architecture seeking to make the world and its economies work, disentangled from political, geographic, human, or non-human obstructions. It also encourages us to think about how history is very much wrapped up in this, and to how erasure tied to nostalgia are always operating in this context, performing the continuing story of colonial infrastructures, both because this new train is allegedly a re-inauguration of the Palestine Railway, a branch of the old Ottoman-built Hejaz Railway, and because of the way infrastructure has always helped produce and erase colonial wars and conquests. A signpost of which can be found in the fact that the name of the railway is now Ha'emek, the valley train, and Palestine is obviously nowhere to be found. Now, nostalgia around the Ha'emek tells us that in 1905, its Ottoman counterpart connected Haifa to Syria, Jordan, and the Arabian Peninsula, and then during the British Mandate, it was further extended to Cairo and helped Haifa become the British Empire's choice for a transit hub for its colonial holdings in the Middle East. And thus it can, and allegedly will, be the key to reconnecting Israel to the region, bringing back its historical glory as a land bridge between Europe and Asia. A glory that obviously never existed and was always a colonial fabrication when it did, but that seems to be beside the point. That nostalgic and willful amnesia has driven the branding of Ha'emek, yes, this is really what it's called, as a peace train, key to economic and security cooperation in what is often depicted as an unstable and insecure region in need, according to its promotional material, of moderate partners for linking it to global capitalists and obviously peace-loving liberal ambitions. All of this works towards helping the world forget and live with the fact that while the railway's original material connections were physically destroyed by Israel's pre-state Jewish militia in 1946 and 1947, its actual links to the region were completely severed in the war of 1948 and Israel's ongoing colonization of Palestine. A reality Israel has been operating with, even relishing in some of the world, as an enclave disconnected from its neighbors for sex. Yet in 2019, the Ha'emek was revealed to the world as the central feature of a project called Regional Tracks for Peace that links Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, which seems like it's clearly reinvigorating the train of the Hejaz as promised by Israel's prime minister when he spoke at its inaugural journey back in 2016. Well, of course, missing Syria and adding the all-important GCC. This project, which Israel's now finance minister, Israel Katz, has literally shopped around to everyone, but especially in very public events in the UAE, points towards a not-so-subtle shift in how Israel sees and articulates itself as part of, rather than severed from, both regional and global flows and circuits. Before explaining this further, I need to step back and out of it, because it coincides with a much larger shift globally in how trade and transport have been working. And you can kind of see this, hopefully, if you see the PowerPoint in front of you. Since 2013, China has helmed a massive infrastructure project that spans over 10,000 kilometers, aimed at linking sea and land traffic between Asia and Europe. This project, known as One Belt, One Road, or the New Silk Road, has positioned the Middle East and its Mediterranean access points as one of its key connective causeways, the corridors that will make the project move, so to speak. The Obor project has reinvigorated global interest in gargantuan development projects financed through public-private partnerships that center deepwater ports, railways, and freeways as part of a desperate search for newer, faster, more secure circuits capable of connecting the different ends of global supply chains, and has also triggered immense competition for control over those corridors and the political and economic benefits that allegedly come with it. Israel's Tracks Regional Peace Project, which also has a featured role in the economic component of Trump's Prosperity to Peace plan, is central to its attempt at taking advantage of this return to infrastructure, especially since part of the Tracks project relies on a new automated container port terminal that begins operation in 2021 and will be run by one of the world's biggest port terminal operators, the Shanghai International Port Group, or SIPG. And while I don't have time to really get into this, this further links Israel to a series of maritime routes that China has already established connections with or control over. For example, the Greek port of Piraeus is also controlled by SIPG. It's also perhaps a good time to mention that the train project was starting to be rebuilt in 2012 at the same time as when Syria erupted, in conflict, and the land routes from Europe to the Middle East were closed down. And at that time, Israel was chosen as one of several viable entry points to the region through caravans of trucks traveling on ships to Haifa and out and onwards through the border with Jordan under what's called the bond customs regulations, a paper trail. And it was on goods that were meant for the Middle East markets and passing through Israel. And so it's important to recognize that this is not a one-way street and doesn't operate just from Israel onwards. Israel, a country that has prided and branded itself as an impenetrable fortress, disconnected from the region in physical, social, and economic terms, having no official diplomatic or economic relations with all but two countries, and even famously calling itself the villa in the jungle with all its racial and colonial significance that you can imagine, and having done everything to culturally, politically, economically link itself to Europe, including through a variety of regulatory and institutional networks, has been reconfiguring itself as connected, or to be more precise, the key to connection, the corridor, and thus destabilizing the region. This is not just a fantasy, although to be honest, it is also a fantasy, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The imaginative geography of the train line is being harnessed, both in Israel and beyond, to make this a reality. Because as we know, there is a kind of global calculation about Israel that secretly, or rather not so secretly, buys into, and I mean kind of literally, its ability to contain Palestine, push violence to its edges, produce high-tech security, surveillance, and arms technologies, while also performing a kind of European whiteness vis-a-vis its neighbors. And while all this is still kind of operating on just below the radar because of the political calculus tied to Palestine, Israel is increasingly being tagged as a potential hub for making capitalism and colonialism continue to organize the region. And the infrastructure of what I'm calling corridor space is key to that. And I feel already I jumped ahead a little bit, and I again need to take a step back to kind of explain how this works. So first of all, when discussing the infrastructure of the TRACS project, I obviously don't just mean the physical or hard infrastructure of rails, roads, and ports, but rather the soft linking mechanisms that move things through space. This brings us to recent work being developed around the revolution in logistics, which due to advances in technology and transport industries is a turn towards intensive management and enhancement of the global circuits and circulations of capital and goods. And when we're talking about logistics, we're actually talking about a very complex integrated system of managing and organizing the infrastructure that connects and links global supply chains. And within that, the incredibly asymmetric, uneven, and distorted manner in which this happens. Furthermore, this is actually tied to a production philosophy known as just-in-time that says that anything standing still and waiting in a warehouse wastes profits, and thus the goods being sold and used must constantly be on the move, which of course requires an incredible amount of control and information. And so revolution in logistics is really about making sure these things flow at all costs, or as Deb Cowan puts it, they need to move or die, which also makes the infrastructure being built to ensure this movement incredibly vulnerable. But of course, we aren't talking about abstract things. These goods need to move through people and places and bypass an endless variety of potential natural, human, or regulatory obstructions and threats. They need to be managed and perfectly coordinated and secured in order to protect them from the horrible and constantly impending destruction, which also gives its protectors impunity to ensure that things keep moving, which we should already recognize in this panel as to being how Israel operates, or rather how the world lets Israel operate. But rather than attempting to control the journey of all these things through vast expanses of territory, the logistics industry works to channel flows through a very tightly controlled and coordinated pipeline architecture, which enables them to push and pull products across the tears and holes of global geography, and thus bypass the particular limits inherent to global geoeconomic relations. These are called corridors. And by creating linking lines between key nodes of transport, they orchestrate a particular global cartography of narrow connectors that circumvent but also concentrate friction at particular points. Focusing on these potential bottlenecks, corridor managers work to further displace and override their potential interruption to the constant mobility and circulation of capital and goods. To make this work, regulations and laws inside those corridors, those kind of wall flows, are deeply standardized. Security is necessarily tight. Control and surveillance are integral, and so they exist alongside and actually produce other lines and spaces that contain potential disruptors. So I need to reiterate, corridors are not neutral or inevitable. They need to be made, sold, secured, and then reshaped in our thinking and practice as an unavoidable part of our geographic common sense. Which now brings us back to the TRACS for regional peace and its normalization of a corridor between Europe, the Mediterranean, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the GCC, as if there are no stopgaps in between. Now, to tell this part of the story, I don't really have time, although I'd love to delve into all the various threads we need to trace and break down to grapple with corridors being the endless private, public, civilian, military, and so on, all these different actors and legal institutional networks that need to be reorganized to make this happen. And I don't want to give you the impression that I actually do know all those details. I don't. I'm still working through it. And I'd love to share knowledge about that afterwards. But I do think Israel's promotional video about this project is really helpful in offering some insight into how it's being imagined and expected to function, and what this corridor implies for Israel's new position, alleged position, as a hub in the Middle East, and thus how borders, politics, and space disappear within its walled flows. So first of all, throughout the video, we're constantly moving, as you can kind of see from the images here. As I've already mentioned, this is key to the fantasy of the corridor and to the world of logistics. The narrator speaks of economic benefits to everyone, including the Palestinian Authority, which will have access to Ha'emek and Ha'emek Report through a railway link they're building. But the video is very clear to demonstrate that even though they have like a line in, there's no onward connection beyond Afula eastwards. And at the same time, the tracks, while they're talking about this, the tracks are constantly transporting us across space, linking oceans and land and ports and rails and countries and markets that have never been connected before. They even give a nod to Iraq in some faraway future. And while geographic distances flash across the screen, the narrator tells us this initiative will create regional trade routes that are shorter, faster, cheaper, and safer. Borders and frictions, politics and people disappear, and the fantasy of the corridor is given flesh and made tangible as it tells us these routes already exist and just need to be harnessed. But this is, of course, tied to a second message imbricated in and sold through the corridor in the making, which is always secure, always vulnerable to disruption, and requires control and security to ensure these circuits continue to move and continue to expand, or else they die. And that it's operating in this important space, which is already branded and produced historically and in the present as a huge security risk. Now, as I said, they're advertising this as a safer space and will, and this I'm quoting from the video, protect against threats emanating from Iran in the Straits of Hormuz and in the Bab al-Mandab, and that, from a strategic viewpoint, the initiative could strengthen the region's pragmatic camp and moreover change the region, strengthen economies, contribute to stability, and promote peace. And here's the real selling point. Because Israel has projected this image of itself as the progressive hub, able to contain and control violence on the bodies of Palestinians, of course. And now that they've partnered with the GCC, which according to Adam Hania, has also been labeled an island of stability in a sea of insecurity. And I hope by now you're noticing not only who's included, but who is explicitly left out. And just Francesca is telling me to stop in a moment. So I'm just going to end with one more thought. So the corridors ensures the safety of the routes, so many others are competing over by bypassing and displacing the violence of the region onto those others that sit outside our reckoning and clearly sit outside the safety of the corridor, which we know is not really about violence, but about who has been imagined and produced as violent, which of course which is of course tangled up with global geographies of race and the colonial capitalist production of the region. And this is what we're actually revealing by shifting our attention to the material journey of the corridor and the violence that travels through it. And I'm also hoping that in the Q&A, we can have a small conversation about what's going on with COVID-19 and what has happened to this kind of entrenchment of this idea of the corridor being necessary to make sure things move. And I'll explain more about that maybe in the Q&A. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Thank you very much, Sharri. Thanks for a very, very interesting presentation. I hope you all hear me. Let's move on to our second speaker, Jan Wilkens. To you, Jan. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation. I think this connects a little bit in a way to Sharri's presentation, actually. The background of what I'm presenting here is my interest in social movements and contentious politics in international relations as an academic discipline, but also international politics as a subject of study. And the background here is that this is a project idea that I'm currently working on, and due to the current situation, it's obviously still work in progress, but it's also kind of shaped by that situation, and I think we can discuss this later on. Oops. So what I will do is to briefly introduce you to the questions and talk about kind of the academic field in which I situate this project, talk about the politics of scale, and then come to the context of Palestine and Israel and BDS, and then discuss an outlook. So the background here is my my work, like in kind of field work with politicians I had here in Europe just before certain decisions have been made, and also certain resolutions. I will come to that German resolution on BDS in a second, where there is an increasing debate about BDS. So as you know, there are various levels, various implications on that kind of relate to the BDS, but also I'd say move beyond that. So my question interest here is, on the one hand, how is it possible that a local movement with limited material capabilities is able to shape international politics and contest meanings of fundamental norms in this context? What I'm also really interested in is, and this is still where I'm working and where further fieldwork is necessary, is the question, how does it affect the global normative structure of meaning and use in regard to the conflict between Palestine and Israel? So the question really is here, what is, let's say, the implications of BDS activism in terms of discursive shifts and its implications for international politics. So again, kind of, I will come also to that in a second. There is a lot debate, of course, about the question of boycotts itself, the legitimacy of boycotts and so on, but the interest here is really more about the effect of that. So why am I introducing the concept of scale? So in international relations, depending on kind of the academic or the paradigm, scale can be seen or is seen in a different way. So if you look into more state-centric approaches like neorealism, scale, of course, is a systemic feature that has a particular role, which is more kind of a static feature, if you like. Then if you move to the norms and constructivist literature, then scale play a role in the sense that there is the question of how assumed global or universalized norms can diffuse or do diffuse to local settings. So then the question here is, what are local, so-called local experiences of global politics? How are local norms translated? How are they enacted in these local settings? In this regard, also scholars will speak about the constitution of politics in local settings. For example, in post-colonial literature or post-colonial approaches to IR, the local agency and of course subject positions are key to understand political dynamics also on a global scale. However, scale is not a kind of a key concept, let's say, so far in IR debates. So territory, sovereignty are more central in IR. However, scale, if we probably have some geographers with us, scale obviously is a central concern for human geography and geography in general. And it has been defined as a spatial level, local, national, or global, at which a presumed effect of local location is operative. So I think that really links to also an understanding that is prevalent in dominant approaches in IR. However, critical scholars have argued here that this analysis through micro binary, so this global local, tends to ignore the politics of scale. So that is the social construction of scale, in which also power unfolds through scale as a representational trope. The most important example, I think, is the nation state, nation government speaking on behalf of a certain group or certain people. So here, political claims and power is also established by expanding to different scales. We might think of national governments making claims about their own citizens who are maybe migrants in other places, or speaking on behalf of social groups that they are not really representing. So there are various groups, various examples in global politics. Human geography has also emphasized that the production of scale is really important in defining boundaries and identities. So I think this is also obvious for scholars in IR. So in these three different spheres, kind of scale production, or this kind of is important in understanding scale production. There is an argument that we need to consider operation, observation, and interpretation. So that is operation, some have called it the ontological moment of scale. So in which scale is produced as an entity. Then there is the observation. So what derives from that? Which kinds of framings and discourses derive from the production of scale? And then obviously also the interpretation. So this relates to the discourse and discourses around scales and implications for power and power claims. So just to give you kind of brief idea of the power of scales in the context of Palestine and Israel, which I think also is not only particular always to Israel and Palestine, but also play out in other settings, which I will just mention in a second. So one important thing is, of course, the biophysical production of scale. So this can include a lot of aspects and highlights the fragility of space as well. So biophysical production of scale can, for example, include the production or the discourse on annexation and the question of extending sovereignty. We see this now in the discourse of the so-called peace plan. So you see here already there are actors, national and international actors involved in kind of reproducing this kind of scale, but it's also implications of climate change that are shaping the biophysical production of scale. So the changing landscape, the changing access to water, for example, this all has implications for the production of scale. Then, of course, the production of scalar hierarchies. I have already mentioned that, and we see this also in the case of BDS, where scalar hierarchies are very important in order to make claims in the name of or on behalf of certain peoples. At the same time, it's also, as you will see in a second, it's important as an hegemonic tool to ignore or neglect certain groups and identities. But as we will also see from in the case of BDS, there is also what I would call translocal activism. Translocal activism is a form of activism where actors in different local settings are making claims on behalf of a certain issue, but they are kind of contextualized in very, very different settings. So it's not just, in this case, BDS activists in Palestine or Israel, but also, of course, in Europe and the US. So what we can see here already is that in the case of norms contestation, it's not just norms kind of traveling, if you like, from the global to the local, but also the other way around. So there is is obviously a limited material impact of BDS activism, but a substantial impact on discursive practices and contentious politics. For those who are engaged already with BDS, you are aware that BDS has been constructed as a security threat. It has also implications for NGOs and the way they can operate in Palestine. It has led Israel's government, of course, to increase its spending to counter BDS on a global scale. But of course, BDS has mobilized support from all over the world, including individuals, organizations, cities, and other kinds of activists. So there is this substantial impact. However, crossing of these scales, I argue here, although it broadens the support, normative claims and the scale are discursively separated, and this kind of reproduces hierarchies. My case here is, my empirical entry point here was a conversation with a lot of German politicians in the run-up to a May 2019 decision to declare BDS as an anti-Semitic organization. So we have support, this resolution gained support from all parties, especially, except for the AfD, but gained support from all parties, from the left to conservative parties. However, within these parties, there were fractions that did not support the resolution. And a key issue here is, of course, that BDS was not only declared as anti-Semitic, but any language, any discourse on Palestine is simply not included, and kind of the BDS debate kind of was separated from the discourse about the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Like in other countries, also in Germany, the national government level was not the only level in which BDS had a strong impact. This resolution in the Bundestag also gained a lot of support by different cultural institutions. It gained support by student movements. Large student movements and parties in Germany supported this resolution. and kind of supported also activism against BDS on campuses and beyond. So Palestinians and BDS activists have broadened the context in which actors engage with the conflict across traditionally perceived scales. So the locality of the conflict appears in various contexts far beyond the region. Yet the power of scales also enables to reproduce hierarchies, as I can already see here. National scale reoccurs as a container through which politics appears to or should occur. So in the BDS discourse on Palestine, Palestinians simply disappear. So the two-state solution and illegal settlements claims that come from, for example, German and European politicians, turned out to be or run danger to be empty signifiers, because there is no mention of Palestinians as political subjects, but there's only this reference to this national and international frame. So the state and the illegality, so this international law discourse. So what I argue here is that scale is an epistemological ordering frame. So far, there's a focus on the legitimacy of BDS and boycotts. And there is also a lot of research, of course, and knowledge about the subject positions in the discursive field of Palestinians and Israelis. Yet there's little knowledge about its impact and the global normative structure of meaning and use regarding the conflict itself. So, kind of this is, of course, the insufficient part here on my side. Here, what I'm currently interested in through further fieldwork is how does it shape the imagination of the beyond two-state solution outside of Palestine and Israel, especially in Europe, and how do these imagination reproduce dominant power structures on different scales? So what about Palestinians as political subjects? How does the BDS related discourse kind of change the perspective on that? So just to conclude, why should we, as scholars, especially as scholars of IR, focus on scales? I think that conceptualizing scale in IR allows to analyze power structures. It questions the reproduction of top-down binary perspectives on how global politics work. It also critically reflects on methodological nationalism as it looks on the state and a given given territory, not in a static way. And it also allows to understand translocal activism as a key global dynamic. So thank you for letting me present this. And I'm looking forward for your questions and, of course, feedback.
All right. Thank you very much for Thank you very much for your presentation. Before we move on to our next speaker, could I just ask our participants if they have any question? They can already write it in the Q&A. If you start writing, it's just easier for me then to start getting organized and maybe dividing them among the speakers. So please feel free. There's a Q&A box down there. All right, two very interesting presentations, and I think a lot of interesting things in common between Jan and Sharri in terms of what they looked at. And now we move to another hot topic, and obviously foreign policy of Israel and its relations to Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia and Israel. It has been a hot topic, and so I'd like to invite Aziz to step in and please.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you very much. And thank you for Sharri and Jan for a very interesting topic. Let me see here. You cannot share. Oh, right. So may I ask Jan if you could stop sharing your screen so I could share mine, please?
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Oh, no problem, Jan. I don't mind. You could talk because it was very.
Try now, Aziz. You should be able now.
Alrighty. 1 second, please. Yep.
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, let me put my timer on. And okay. All right, thank you everybody, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to present on the panel here today. And as you could see from my title, my name is Abdulaziz Alghashian. I'm a lecturer in international relations in the government department. And what I would like to present here today is my idea or my paper and argument about Saudi-Israeli passive cooperation. And this is today's structure and what I will be presenting today. So today, hopefully, what I would like to do is to present firstly and conceptualize what do I mean by cooperation and try to understand and expand upon this idea. And then I want to hopefully highlight a framework and then apply it to both the Saudi-Israeli phenomenon during Desert Storm and also the Saudi-Israeli phenomenon on Iran. So the Saudi-Israeli passive cooperation on Iran. And then we might have a look into what Saudi-Israeli active cooperation can take place in the future. And then some practical questions where I could get some feedback later on. So firstly, I would like to position myself in the literature regards to the typology of cooperation and in regards to how have scholars explained the type of cooperation that takes place between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And this is what I would like to highlight first. And I think there are different types. You could see here, the first one is that it has been described by as a Saudi-Israeli alliance. Of course, in Davidson, 2003, his book, After the Sheikhs, he explains that there was this unholy alliance between them. Pages 175 to 179, he says that there is this notion of an alliance. And also more recently, there are others, Robinson also says in his work, The Death of a Two-State Solution, that there is a de facto alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And personally, this is something that I argue against, with respect, of course, but I argue the fact that the notion of alliances, due to its contractual, obligatory nature, is perhaps not the most suitable way of describing and at least theorizing a Saudi-Israeli form of cooperation. Now we look at other work, and we've seen here, for example, the notion of tacit cooperation. And this is, as you can see from the dates, it's far more recent. And this is what I tend to agree on, is that there's this form of tacit cooperation, that there are these unspoken rules, that there are these very flexible forms of agreement. And their contributions is something that I wish to expand upon. And I think especially in the work of Jones and Guzenski, they offer a theorization, or they offer a theory of tacit security regimes. Now, although this is something that I find as a good contribution, this is how we should be thinking about Saudi-Israeli relations. In their work, it was more of a Gulf Israeli relations, and you could see from the titles itself, it's a perspective from Israel also, and so this is where I start to differentiate myself at this point, and then try to say, well, okay, if there is a tacit form of cooperation, how about we expand upon this notion of passive form of cooperation. And here, the work, I borrow this concept of passive cooperation from Giovannetti and Pega. And really, I also, I borrow, I have a synthetic approach to developing this framework of cooperation. So I borrow this idea, and Giovannetti and Pega it's an economist paper, but I found here that the literature on economics and economic theory has been helpful, but applying it will be a little bit different. So now, what do I mean by passive cooperation? Allow me to give more, to define it. I define passive cooperation as a process where two actors intentionally reach their mutual goal without policy adjustment. Now, I will look at this policy adjustment afterwards. And at the heart of passive cooperation is another concept of focal points. Now, in the work of Thomas Schelling here, he expands upon, or he coined this term focal point, which basically in game theory, in the literature of game theory, this kind of a coordinative game, a coordinative situation where actors reach the same goal without explicit coordination, or with absence of coordination. So this is how I would like to prefer to look at the Saudi-Israeli goals. And it has two forms. It has a harmonious passive cooperation and a static form of cooperation, and we will expand upon this afterwards. Or I will now just hopefully explain what this might look like. So this is what a passive cooperation would look like, as opposed to an active form of cooperation that has taken place. I argue that Saudi Arabia and Israel during Desert Storm and currently in Iran have cooperated in a very passive way. As you could see from, I don't know if you can see my mouse here or the pointer, but I'm going to point at it here. If there was to be any form of active Saudi-Israeli cooperation, there would have been a form of policy adjustment. And policy adjustment is also a concept that I take from Kyoane in his book After Hegemony, where he attempts to separate between what is a harmony and what is cooperation. And then he says, well, cooperation is actually where something happens called where policy adjustment. And here you could see explicit coordination and explicit communication taking place. Now, I argue that so far, the mutual goals that Saudi Arabia and Israel have taken place or taken shape without any policy accommodation. Instead, their policies have reached the mutual goal, the focal point. And a focal point here is a very general point that does not need any kind of communication nor coordination to highlight that this is actually a goal. It's, in other words, it's common sense and it's clear and it's very salient. And that's what reduces the need for an explicit cooperation, or explicit cooperation and active cooperation and explicit coordination. Now, of course, the benefits that it enables deniability, it avoids external constraints, a lack of contractual obligations, which is what happens in alliances to a certain extent, and I would like to know more about this. And avoids being a political center of gravity. And this is kind of the work from, oh, I forgot his name, my goodness. This is the work from a center of gravity. I'm sorry, it's tip of my tongue and I forgot the work. But the costs, some of the costs here is a lack of explicit coordination and there's no burden sharing. And now let's try to apply this into the Saudi-Israeli situation in the Gulf. Now, before looking at this idea, before looking at, let's try to set the situation. During Desert Storm, and I don't want to go into Desert Storm, the regional context there was a regional context where the Intifada was there, Iran and Iraq. Iraq just came out of a war. And there was basically no appetite for peace with Israel. There and any kind of collaboration or communication or any kind of alignment with Israel was very much distant, and it was not desired. However, what increased the focality between Saudi Arabia and Israel was Saddam Hussein's alarming rhetoric. And of course, in April 1990, Saddam Hussein then starts to expand upon his fiery rhetoric and discourse and says, well, you know, we're going to have half of our fire, or our fire eat half of Israel. And this, of course, alarmed Israel. But in the attempt to de-escalate the tensions, the then Saudi king dispatched then Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar, in the Bandar Hussein meeting, I call here, in Iraq, and to say, well, you know, to de-escalate the situation. In this discussion, you could see that, or Saddam Hussein then disclosed a very a significant problem, or disclosed his intentions. And he said to the prince, he said, Prince, I don't want you to believe the Zionist propaganda that I'm going to invade other small Gulf countries. So please don't believe them. And then the prince then said, well, what are you talking about? No one accused you of that. And then he relayed that information back to the king, the Saudi king. And then, of course, this generated that focality. This generated that there is a suspicion. That's what built that relationship, that focality between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, this is what I argue took place in the Saudi-Israeli during Desert Storm, Saudi-Israeli focal point during Desert Storm. During the building of the coalition, Saudi Arabia needed Israel to stay out of the war in order to make their coalition legitimate. However, when they in the process of building this coalition, Saudi Arabia, the Saudi ruling elite, very interestingly, said, well, I don't see myself, or we don't see ourselves not defending ourselves if Israel defends itself. And it was the whole process of trying to get Israel out of the war. That was the whole point of that, Israel not trying to enter into the Gulf War. And these are the sources that I look at. I don't want to go into detail what they all say, but these are the sources that they look at, or what they says. So here in Seal, for example, this is Khalid bin Sultan. He also says, you know, this is a book of his biography. Ross, very interesting discussions here taking place between the Saudi ambassador and also then the Saudi, of course, the minister, the State Department, saying that, listen, there will be this harmony of interest taking place. Now, during the Scud crisis, Israel tried to have, to fly over Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia rejected. In other words, and theoretically speaking, Saudi Arabia and Israel did not have active cooperation. And that's how it would have looked like if Saudi Arabia and Israel would have flew over, or if Israel would have flew over Saudi Arabia, Saudi territory. Now, passive cooperation also took place. I'm running out of time here, but passive cooperation also took place. Israel is also something that we have to look at. Now, was Israel intending on being inactive during that war, or were they not? And I argue that it was certainly part of the calculation that Israel wanted to stay inactive, stay passive, and allow themselves to be static. Now, this is the results of the passive cooperation. It made the work, hold on here. It made the work, sorry. It made the work very, It made the Madrid Peace Conference palatable. There was a change of Israeli perception within Saudi Arabia. And most importantly, it demonstrated that Saudi Arabia and Israel actually do depend on each other in some way or another, or at least in a passive sense. And that Israel is part of the system and part of the security calculation. I unfortunately ran out of time. I think it's 15 minutes. I don't know if I could have 5 more minutes just to explain the rest of the slides, if that's okay, Francesco.
You can have a minute more, maybe 2.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So now I'm taking this idea and then trying to apply it into the focality of Iran. As you could see here from one of the slides, or the slide in front of me, and this is, by the way, I'm not trying to say that this is a Shiite crescent or anything like that, but this is how the Saudi-Israeli perception viewed Iran as they are encircled by them. And as a result, there was no real need to highlight any kind of, or have any kind of explicit coordination to argue that this is the goal. And as a result, the goals, the irrespective goals, or the respective goals of both Israel and Saudi Arabia has facilitated the benefit of each other. And that is what I'm arguing here. So of course, these are aspects of generality, and this is the aspect here of what created the focality between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, one of the things that I wanted to look at also is, how is this being maintained? How is the focal point being maintained between Saudi Arabia and Israel? And one of the reasons that one of the aspects that we look at here is that I think not only is it just enough to say that there is a general goal, but also the use of language here has to be very much emphasized on. There has to be a very vague, flexible, unfixed form of language. Let's not forget that there is no love lost between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And then, but the antagonism between them is very much measured, and it's measured and calculated. And then there is the deniability of cooperation between them, or the deniability of active cooperation between them, is limited. That Saudi Arabia does not have to deny, or it's easily denying, any form of active cooperation, because active cooperation does not take place. They don't have embassies. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly where they meet and how they have collaborated, because of the generality of their goal. And these are just the constraints that I could talk about later on. And this is something that, now currently takes place. And one of the focal points, if I could compare, is that in Iraq, the constraints that Saudi Arabia faced at that time were very strong, and the domestic constraints were very strong, and the Arab coalition was very strong. I'm sorry, the Arab coalition would have crumbled. Now in Iran, domestically in Saudi Arabia, we're starting to see, due to the increased form of nationalism, we're starting to see more calls to cooperate with Israel. And perhaps the Palestinian issue is becoming less and less of a top priority than it used to be. It's still very high, but due to the nationalism, it's actually becoming less and less of a constraint. However, there is still a significant constraint that Saudi Arabia faces, and that is how it identifies itself. It cannot afford to have any kind of collaboration with Israel outside of a peace agreement. And that's what I mentioned here, is that Saudi Arabia is willing to have conditional active cooperation with Israel. And this is due to the Arab Peace Initiative and so on. So it cannot go out of this framework. And if they do have active cooperation, it's going to be very ad hoc and incredibly quiet. And I think for the current times now, what will happen was the Israeli annexation will just further will further prospects of official active cooperation, and we'll see more passive cooperation taking place between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And then these are just the final remarks. One of the questions that I wanted to pose is that how should we treat reports? Because a lot of these discussions is based on, well, based on this report and based on that report and based on a report that so-and-so have been cooperating, so-and-so have met, that these officials, and actually it's just reports. So I just wanted to talk more about the notion of building our understanding of Saudi-Israeli cooperation based on reports. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm sorry for taking a bit of people's time. And
all right, thank you very much. Okay, then let's move on to our. Thanks for the very interesting presentation, as I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Javier, our fourth speaker. Javier, you have a PowerPoint, or can you share it, or?
Yeah, I'll try to share the screen, and if it doesn't work, I send to you.
Are you still sharing?
I'm so
Would you stop sharing, please?
Yeah, I stopped.
Okay.
Stop sharing, actually.
Oh, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going perfect. All right, 15 minutes. Thank you.
Great. So this is part of a paper that I'm about to submit, so I'll be very grateful for any comments, any ideas to improve its final edition, which is originally more focused on urban studies, because the case study of Rawabi is a very exceptional one, and I think it provides very insightful analysis about how urban theories and urban models play out in different contexts. But it also sheds a lot of light in terms of the shifting and often turbulent relations between the Israeli, Palestinian, and Khaliji triangle. So this is what I'll be focusing on this presentation. So Rawabi is which literally means hills, in something we will go back to at some point. It's a city that a planned city in the West Bank, very close to Ramallah and Birzeit, and it's the idea of Palestinian businessman Basar Masri, who's been the main promoter and investor, and most of the funding has come through his own willingness. And here's the master plan of the city, which is mostly residential space. You can see over here the central area is a commercial area, a retail area, and there's some public facilities. There's a theater. It's labeled as one of the spaces with one of the foremost entertainment facilities in the West Bank. So it was inaugurated in 2010, and the first residents moved there in 2014. And the main thing in terms of political economy of the city is that there's an annex tech hub, which puts in place also the economic relations, dependency or development with the Israeli tech hub. So the city has a capacity of 40,000 people, and its main objective is to become a state-of-the-art tech city in the West Bank to develop the economy. There are a number of caveats about this because of the dependency on Israeli economy and external funding, and also the target of this development, which is not the whole Palestinian or West Bank population, but mostly which is largely dependent on foreign aid, but on middle high class that lives behind a population that has been largely neglected over the years. So I think it's an interesting case in terms of studying how the relation between the Gulf or the GCC countries and Israel, because it shows how these relations are becoming more explicit in the last 5 to 10 years, if not more. And it has been also largely described as a cheap option for Silicon Wadi, this strip mostly centered around Tel Aviv, to outsource some of its activity for cheaper labor, basically. And that's the main thing that has been happening. The framework that I'm using for this paper is the urban regime model, which was developed around the cities of Dallas, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia, which basically states that the governmental coalition of cities is not so much, or in this case, is not so much the voters or the people, but a coalition of companies or private businesses and the local, the city hall. But it's been largely a US-centered theory, and I think in the case of Rawabi, it plays out very well for a number of reasons. Even if it's not just private capital, but these Khaliji public-private partners that Alam Hania has recently treated in money markets and monarchies. And that is actually the real body of government of Rawabi, and not its residents, as we will see. I also claim that it is also a continuation of the Israeli settler colonial project, not in terms of moving population there, but from an economic perspective, since the main economic activity is dependent on the Israeli tech sector, and which can be understood as some part of the Israeli expansionist project and program. And also, it's got an element of surveillance capitalism, if not surveillance urbanism, which is the main urban concept that the Khaliji capital has been exporting in the Middle East and abroad as well. Oftentimes, under the label of smart cities, Rawabi has been presented as a smart city, and this is that origin of the capital is the telecom sector in Qatar, which has been the money that has made Rawabi possible, other than Basar Masri's capital, which is also clearly linked to the Khaliji businesses, as we will see. To put this in context, on paper, the GCC stances, and the GCC itself has stated that they will not have relations with Israel, the countries that form the GCC. But in fact, relations are bilateral in a more active or less active way, in different ways. Each country of the GCC has a different approach to its relations with Israel. And so in a way, there's some kind of schizophrenia, meaning that in public, there are no relations, but in private, they are, as Aziz has been showing us as well. These relations have been there from a long time, but there's also true that there's been real change, and one of the changes is that the shift in the relations, or at least in terms of sympathy, public sympathy, from the Arab Peace Initiative of King Abdullah to and the now more outspoken collaboration with Mohammed bin Salman and King Salman. There's also the recent visit of Benjamin Netanyahu to Oman, and also the Omani, I think it was the foreign minister, call for recognizing Israel as a state. And there's also the trade between the UAE and Israel, mostly focused on IT and, again, surveillance businesses. And of course, this festival of nonsense that the Peace for Prosperity conference which took place in Bahrain with Jared Kushner and all these people recently was there. So there are mostly, again, to keep putting this in context, three trends. Even there's an overall trend of increased collaboration between the GCC and Israel. There are three main trends. One with Kuwait, which probably because of the closer and then the disappointing relations between Palestine and Kuwait, and during the 90s the disappointment with the PLO and the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam and so on. There's also this trend that better represented by Qatar and Oman, which is more of a hedging approach. Qatar had a trade office in its soil, an Israeli trade office in its soil in 1996. Then it was closed for pressure due to a gathering of Arab leaders sponsored mostly by King Abdallah. Oman, as we have said, Netanyahu has been there recently. And there's the more outspoken collaboration between the Mohammed bin Zayed axis, if I may call it that way, between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, and Egypt as well, which is not a GCC country, but it's been there. It's a very vocal member of that coalition, in which some of the reasons I like for that are the fact that Iran is the main enemy, even if this can be argued and disputed with the case of the Qatar blockade, when Qatar became the enemy, or the trade enemy at least. Also, one of the reasons behind this is the Israeli fundamental role as an IT and weapon export country, as a necessary, maybe, or convenient step to get closer to the US, and also as part of our regional alliance in terms of stability in the Middle East, from a Saudi, UAE, and Bahraini perspective, of course. So this is a picture of the central area of Rawabi. This is probably a bunch of people having some Starbucks coffee after taking a break from their probably related to the tech sector jobs. And this time before, the relation between or the dependency of Rawabi and in general the West Bank economy to the Israeli economy can be. There are already some companies that have been outsourcing their necessities to the Rawabi tech area or tech hub, such as Mellanox, which is an Israeli tech giant, or the Israeli headquarters of Microsoft have also outsourced some of the work to Asal Technologies, which is a company owned by Basar Masri, and it's one of the first tech companies that have been pushing the viability of the project. This picture also shows the reproduction of the urban model of the GCC in general, which the ideas that have been treated by Yasser al-Shistawi in the model of Dubai, but also in other places. As you can see that in Doha, this idea of the mall city, in which the mall is the foremost public space, even if it's a private space, which also takes us to this idea of the surveillance capital and businesses that have been incorporated to this project. And this is the Q Center, which is largely or mostly funded by Qatar, by Qatar TL, which is a big conglomerate of Qatar that owns a lot of franchises in the Middle East of companies such as, you can see New Balance over there, but there are also many others. And one of the main responsibles of exporting this urban model based on real space and the mall in the Middle East. You can look at what's happening in Cairo right now as well, in Egypt in general, in Jordan, and in the region as a whole. Also in Africa is one of the main targets of investment for this type of cooperation. And this shows the fact that at least through the back door, this is a way of normalizing the relations between the GCC, or Qatar in this case, and Israel, since it's been Qatar who has enabled the possibility of building this city as the main investor, but also it has been depicted in Israeli media as a good thing for Israel as well, which also should lead us to think that if Israel is okay with this publicly, then there's definitely something going on with them. And we probably won't see them as participating in a picture showing the urban of such as this. You can see here the CEO of Qatar DR, the main investor. You can see here Salam Fayed, which has been the foremost sponsor of neoliberal, we're thinking of the West Bank and Palestine in general, Fatah. This is Basar Masri, and the CEO of the Palestine Investment Conference. Probably there should be someone of the Israeli tech sector here, but I don't think that picture is going to take place ever, despite the centrality of its participation. So wrapping up and going to the conclusion, so we can have a Q&A and a fruitful discussion. Rawabi shows that there's an increased trend of collaboration and outspoken and public collaboration between the GCC countries and Israel and Palestine. And it's mainly three axes that have been in place here. One, the requirements of Silicon Valley, the Israeli tech sector, and also the sponsorship of the Israeli government. The Palestinian business elite, which is also clearly connected to the Khaliji capital. Bashar Masri made most of his money and his capital in businesses in the Gulf, and also the participation of Qatari capital. So in a way, also Rawabi, as I said before, is a consequence of Israeli settler colonialism, making the city, which architecturally also has been in an awkward way compared to the Israeli settlements in the West Bank that described in this book, a city on a hilltop, because it's also on a hilltop, Rawabi, and it shows that the main terms of the conversation, in terms of the Palestinian issue, are now widely acknowledged to be the economic piece of that Benjamin Netanyahu sponsored. There's no real alternative being posed by political forces in the region besides resistance in Palestine, or maybe some sponsorship of anti-colonial political parties by Qatar, with as being one of the main funders of Hamas. But the thing is that the solutions proposed for the occupation mainly acknowledge the fact that the West Bank and Gaza, as well as this headline said, that the Peace for Prosperity program wanted to make Gaza a new Dubai, is showing that the economic peace, that this framework is the main narrative. Whatever we talk about, one-state solution, two-state solution, annexation, whatever that happens finally, or any kind of other empowerment for the Palestinian, if that's even possible. And for the goal of the people that was writing, dealing with urban theory, it's also a way to decenter the urban regime theory from the US, and showing that it can be reframed or incorporate other case studies that do not take place in the US, but also in very specific places such as the West Bank. And as a case, as this theory then shows that this theory can provide some insights about the shifting relations between Israel, Palestine, and the Khaliji capital and the Khaliji political economies on a local context, and that the trend is there's no other narrative on the table. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Javier. Thank you to all of our panelists for very interesting presentations. We got a lot of questions. I'm going to start with a few of them. Maybe try to divide them among speakers. Some of them are specific to some of you guys. And if I could ask you, when you are answering a question, to put your video on as well if possible. Okay, so the first one is for Sharri, and it's from Gerard Murphy. So Gerard Murphy asks, how is Palestine being represented in the origins of the railway plans and those lands/spaces? And then after that, if we could move on to Jan, I've got actually two questions for you, Jan. One is, what is Israel's opinion of the BDS, and in what ways can it be more effective on an international scale? This might actually be for you or for other speakers as well, but I sort of think it's mostly for you. And then there is one, again, from Gerard Murphy, and then there's one from Jasmine Ghani for Jan again. Jan, you're going very strong there. Very interesting paper. You've worked on translocalism in the Syrian context too. What parallels would you draw between the two cases, Syrian and Palestine-Israel Thanks, Jasmine. I think this is the Center for Syrian Studies try to sort of claim you back, bring you back to that kind of Syria research. Okay, should we start with this? Should we start with Sharri, then Jan, and then we move on to our two other panelists, and I'll go for some other questions. Sharri.
So I thought the question was a little bit hard to translate, and so I'm going to kind of try to think about it the way I think that it was intended, as kind of how does Israel kind of talk about the train in terms of its past as part of Palestine, maybe? I don't know if somebody else wants to intervene there, but that was how I sort of read the question. And again, like, this is tied to the way Israel always brands its historical memory of Palestine as if it didn't happen. Like, everything about that train would be linked to its Ottoman kind of history and then its British history, but it would still be called Ha'emek in most of the literature around the train, as if Palestine was never even part of the name. And it's interesting, if you go and look at billboards that they've kind of put up along this historic route, it's all talking about that Ottoman history. And that's the way most monuments kind of operate in the Israeli space. They literally kind of cut out a whole, they literally cut out history in order to efface and erase Palestine. And that's part of, that's part of the terrain of those spaces, is that Palestine cannot exist in Israel's kind of self-branding as Israel. That's kind of, yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Jan, please, you want me to repeat the questions for you, or?
No, I just figured out how to reach the Q&A here. Yeah, so thanks for both questions. Well, I think in terms of well, Israel's opinion, well, it's difficult, I think, to say, because it really obviously depends on who you ask. I think that, you can see that there are obviously activists within Israel that also support at least parts of BDS. So there's a lot of different groups, but like in terms of the Israeli government, at least, I think they have been very effective in kind of drawing a picture or drawing a thread here. And I think that's really interesting if you kind of look into the history of BDS, kind of the point in, I think, 2008, 2009, when they started to realize that although the movement is not able to kind of really kind of cause material damage, if you like, but they are able to kind of shift the discourse. So, and I think this is really an interesting point, because after kind of, or with the Second Intifada, Palestinians increasingly used kind of or made use of the language of international law. So there was this clear idea, and you can see this in BDS, to go global, to really get global support. And I think it took some time when the government then realized, okay, this can be really a danger in the sense of discourse. And I think, and not just spending, a lot of resources into campaigns, but also really focusing on restructuring the discourse on BDS. They have been quite effective. And I mean, I think it really depends also on the national context. I think it's a huge difference if you look into the BDS discourse, for example, in the UK or US compared to Germany, for example. So here, well, I mean, we have this debate, of course, whether BDS is anti-Semitic or not, and obviously that's also the case in other contexts. But in Germany, due to the history and so on, there are other debates, kind of follow-up debates on that. So I think on an international level, they already have been quite successful in a way, because they have, or because the question is to what extent the legal claim to fundamental rights by Palestinians and BDS activists can be heard kind of again. And I think the German case, even those political actors not supporting the resolution I presented have difficulties to kind of really support Palestinians. And I think that's kind of an interesting case. So I think, yeah, here there's already kind of a discursive power structure. I'm not sure if that really kind of answers your question, but I think, yeah, that there is already an important or powerful discourse here. Yeah, thanks, Jasmine, for your questions. No, you don't be afraid. You don't have to kind of pull me back to. I'm of course still no. I think, well, this is exactly my interest here, because I am still working on this in the Syrian context. My interest is really in also actually comparing it to another case, because me as a qualitative researcher, and I are, the danger is often that you only focus on kind of one case, and the question then is, okay, what does it really tell us about other cases? What does it tell us about the region and kind of translocal, in my case, translocal dynamics? And I think there are commonalities in the sense that we see a lot of activism in Europe, in different countries, in different contexts, in support or like in support of BDS or against BDS. And in a similar way, we see Syrian activism also, for example, now in Germany, there is a huge, or it could be like, of course, given the situation, the focus is limited, but there is this case against in the criminal court, so where Syrian officers have been brought to German courts to stand trial for crimes against humanity. I think there are these overlaps where a focus on a case like Syria or also Palestine needs to be also broadened to activists that are far outside of the places themselves. However, the difference is, I think, that in the BDS example, you have a lot of non-Palestinian activists included, while the Syrian translocal activism is very much kind of, let's say, carried by Syrians themselves in Germany, in different European countries. Of course, with the support of local parties and so on, but kind of, I think the dynamic is kind of, or let's say the internal dynamic is a bit different. But I think the similarity, and that makes it so interesting for me, is that I think we see a very interesting international dimension of the region, if you like, and that's outside of the region. And I think that really makes it worth to look at both cases and also to really compare both cases.
All right, thank you very much. I'm gonna briefly move to Aziz and Javier, and I'm gonna come back to you guys later on because I've seen there are a couple of questions that you noticed before. So I've got one for, a few for Aziz actually. I'm gonna try to sort of wrap them up in one or two, and then you take it however you want, if you want to separate them or answer them together, up to you. So the first one is from Aisha Al-Rashdi, and she asks, my question is for Dr. Aziz. You kept on referring to passive cooperation interaction between Saudi Arabia and Israel that is meant to achieve a certain goal. What are those goals? Are they regime survival or regional balance? Also, if you don't mind, can you expand further on your point of interpreting this passive cooperation in relation to the Arab nationalism element within the Saudi national identity. I'm gonna sort of leave the questions for the panel for later on, and I'm gonna go to this other question, which I saw here from Jasmine. She asks, enjoying your paper so far, to what extent is Saudi-Israel tacit cooperation basically pivots around their mutual alliances with the United States? Is it simply a byproduct of bandwagoning, especially in the unipolar moment immediately after the Gulf War? The US is in background for your presentation, but should you explicitly be at the forefront? Thanks, Jasmine. So Aziz, if you want to take these two, because I think they are sort of...
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think these are really, really good questions. And the thing is, I knew I would speak a lot and go over the time because I had to have a very nuanced approach in regards to the differences and try to highlight the differences between goals that Saudi Arabia and Israel might have and a goal. And this is why I try to use the notion of focal points, because when I put my definition of passive cooperation revolves around a mutual goal, and it is therefore very general. So I think I look here at the question, and is it regional balance? Yes, something like that. It's not necessarily a passive cooperation won't take place between Saudi Arabia and Israel if it was something very specific, if it was something that really needs explicit coordination on. So it is something like regional balance. It is something like regional influence in the Iranian influence in the region. And what this does is that it allows both Saudi Arabia and Israel to address this same goal in a with different motivations that they have. So not necessarily anything explicitly clear that they want to focus on. And as a result, the way they go about it, how they go about it, when they go about it, in itself, it becomes cooperative due to the generality and the focality of the goal, the saliency of the goal. And that's why I try to use this concept of use the concept of focal point within passive cooperation. And of course, if anybody has more information that they want to discuss, they're more than welcome to discuss with me and contact me. But in regards to nationalism and the Saudi nationalism, I think for whoever's following Saudi Arabia now domestically and the discourse, because it's actually very good to be in a panel that appreciate discourse, because I very much appreciate discourse, and I think language is so important in these relations and a unit of analysis. Whoever views or is following the current Saudi-Israeli relationship, or at least the discourse of Israel within Saudi Arabia, they will see that due to the immense amount of nationalism, there are actually calls to normalize with Israel. And there are people that are saying, hey, the Palestinian cause, it's not my cause anymore. And you see this recycling of American first, Trump, America first to Saudi first. And even there's been hashtags in Arabic that says the cause is not my cause. Even because they even said it in a Levant kind of dialect. The cause is not my cause any longer. So these calls for normalization of relations with Israel kind of makes a domestic constraint between Saudi Arabia and Israel less significant. It doesn't become a significant factor. In other words, it paves the way. It helps pave the way for an active cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel, because now the domestic constituency within Saudi Arabia, some of them, or a big portion of them, are due to the immense amount of nationalism there, will legitimize any kind of relationship with Israel because it's in Saudi's interest. However, if, hypothetically speaking, there is this agreement or normalization to any kind of extent between Saudi Arabia and Israel, if there is an active cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel that's public and clear, this goes against what Saudi Arabia projects as a state that defends Muslim rights, that defends, you know, the Palestinian cause, that is the leader of a leader within the Muslim world. Now, are they perceived as the leaders in the Muslim world? This is a whole different debate. How people perceive Saudi Arabia as a Muslim country or an Arab leading country, this is a different debate. But it's Saudi Arabia in itself and how it perceives itself. This is, so there's a symbolic obstacle and a constraint to a cooperation with Israel. And there has to be that conditionality that Javier mentioned in the Arab Peace Initiative, because it stipulates the conditions upon an active cooperation. Now, lastly, if I may, about the United States and passive cooperation. What makes, in my opinion, of course I would say it since I developed it, very interesting about passive cooperation, is that it's a process which is very much contingent upon other factors. In the work of Christopher Phillips, in his work, I think the battle for Israel, the battle, I'm sorry, for Syria, he beautifully summarized Saudi foreign policy, which is a policy that leads from the back, and it kind of allows, you know, people to take more of a frontline lead to especially Israeli-Palestinian situation or Israeli Arab dynamics, and they're at the back. They're at the back front, or I'm sorry, at the back, maintaining that passive distance of not being too close and not being too far. And in regards to passive cooperation, there is an element of a third party here, that perhaps a third party in the United States, we've seen the JCPOA or the Iran deal, and symbolize or stipulate or signifies, I'm sorry, it signifies that there is a vacuum of other states achieving their goal, that both Saudi Arabia and Israel need an other to cooperate with in order to address its security goals. In other words, it cannot unilaterally, or it'll be very limited in order to address its security interests unilaterally. So with the withdrawing of the United States, this then facilitates more room for other actors to play a bigger role in achieving their regional focal points. And that's how it facilitates Israel. And that's how the role of the United States plays here. Of course, the role of the United States is different between the Iraqi focal point, which in Desert Storm, it was very important to relay communication between Saudi Arabia and Israel, one-sided communication, that, listen, please stay out the war. Please stay out the war. So there was this relayer of information to a certain extent, not a very large extent. But at the same time, the role of the United States played a different role in the focal points. And I wanted to examine that in the differences and compare and contrast them. But what I just did in 15 minutes is 13,000 chapters that I just tried to put in one paper. So there's a lot of things that I wanted to look at, but I hope that answers the question. I'm looking forward to other questions.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm very conscious of time because we have a few good questions, or several good questions actually, for our speakers. But I'm going to use my endless power as a chair, and I'm going to ask the questions I wanted to ask for a while to Javier, if that's all right. Javier, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So you sort of hinted towards the end. Now, obviously, your paper is fascinating in the details that it provides, but you're not only telling us a story about Rawabi, you're telling us something more. Do you expect to see any other small Rawabi mushrooming in the near future? And if that, what would take for that to happen? Then I will read a question. I'll leave you with that, and I'll read a question, sort of a comment for all of you guys, and then I'm going to go back to Sharri for another question, if that's okay. So the comment question is from Eddie Wasnich. So Eddie asks, my question is mainly relevant to Sharri, Abdulaziz, and Javier. So you welcome any insights from them. So everybody except you, Jan, basically. It relates to less formal, softer elements of cooperation. We see the high level often covered by increasingly overt exchange within Israel and Gulf Arab states in particular. Also, the emphasis on economic infrastructural links, as Sharri highlighted. How important are the softer links being developed, such as cultural, scientific, educational, exchange? How much is going on the ground, away from high politics, in this set of relationships? So I guess really this is for whoever on the panel wants to take it. And finally, if I could go back to Sharri, if that's okay, I've got a question/comment from Yasmin. Thank you so much for your for really original paper. Using infrastructure is a great way to think about the materialization of colonial ideas, from imagination to reality, admittedly in creative and diverse ways. Struck me there is an interesting parallel between the use of a railway in Israel-Palestine context and British obsession with their contribution of the railway in colonial India. How often the railway is presented under masks of development and positive investment? Thanks. So if I could have Javier, and then whoever of you guys wants to pick up the second, and then go back to Sharri.
Yeah, I think Rawab is the first. It's not just the first example. It's the first essay to see if a new way of expansion, economic expansion, that accommodates the needs of not just Israel but also the Gulf. And if it works, I would probably, I mean, if it's profitable, I would argue that it's going to be a trend in the near future. We are still rate of annexation. Rawab is in areas A and B mostly, so it shouldn't be affected by annexation if it happens or not. But again, the main issue with the expansion in the West Bank by Israel is that the Zionism is about land and population, and recent laws like the proclamation of Israel as a Jewish state will be something that would be contested if the annexation includes the population residing in areas that are supposed to be annexed. So that would be something complicated. And I think Rawabi is a way to make since I think it's the example of, or an example of the death of the failure of the Oslo process. I mean, everyone knows that Oslo failed from a number of years, but example by the Palestinian population. And in a way, I think it's also a way to translate the apartheid in Israeli soil to the West Bank, because you're not focused on the whole Palestinian population, but can or invest there or work there. So I think it's a way to moving forward the process in a different way, and acknowledging that the so-called economic, unfortunately for most Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, of course, which is also one of the main areas that is forgotten. So I think that, I mean, the Kushner-led conference in Bahrain was probably nonsense, but I think it's revealing, because it shows that this trend is also it's everywhere, and it's the only thing that is being posed as a future development initiative. And obviously, Gaza is not going to become a new debate, but I think there are going to be efforts in different scales of urban scales, if you will, of tech hubs. Maybe not a whole city like Rawabi, but different economic expansions in different places of the West Bank, and let's see what happens in Gaza. In Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, is more than clear that it's been incorporated to the Israeli state. But yeah, I think it's going to be a trend. I mean, probably I shouldn't think what the future would look like, but I think it's if Rawabit shows to be functional, I think we're going to see examples of little Rawabis within cities or new whole cities, and it's going to be the new normal in the West Bank and maybe in Gaza as well. And which, I mean, in my view, it's just a rejection of agency for the whole Palestinian population. And it's also a trend that Israel has been fostering over the years. Daniel, of course, has this book about how fragmenting and demobilizing the Palestinian population has been a sponsored effort by Israel, and not only Israel, to shy away from other initiatives that might empower economically or politically the Palestinian territories as a whole. So I think that goes also with Edward's question.
Yep, certainly answer that one as well.
Increasing, because and there, I think that we're witnessing now a change, and that's where there are some things that are showing and others that are not showing yet, such as cultural exchanges. We have been seeing how some Saudi citizens, UAE citizens, we have seen. I think one of the goals of the Bahrain conference was to normalize the presence of Israelis in the Gulf. I think that was one of the key issues of that conference, besides any solution that was not going to take place. And we also saw images of Israelis in the Gulf. It was highly promoted on Twitter and in social media in general. And I think that's going to be a new normal in Israel as well. There have been this Saudi blogger that traveled to Israel recently. I think that's going to be more common as time goes on.
All right, thank you very much. Does anyone want to address Ed's question on soft power?
If I may, is that
please?
Yeah, I'll do just be very brief. Which clearly I'm very good at, as you all can see. Just expanding upon what Javier said, there is also a generational element to this about the soft power and the cultural exchanges. Before, especially within the ruling elites, they were all part of a time where the Arab-Israeli conflict was at a high, where it was kind of the relationship where it was the top priority, and liberating Palestine was the top priority. And I think in recent years, due to the generational change and due to the other increases of different forms of threats and different dynamics of threats and so on, this kind of paved the way to a generational, there is a generational shift. And this also kind of paves the way to a more soft power approach. Not soft power approach, but this is more of a bottom-up approach now. We're starting to see a bottom-up dynamic, where before the constraints were bottom-up. Now, actually, the main thing that could facilitate relations, and rather than Arab-Israeli conflict, Arab-Israeli relations, what could facilitate relations is a bottom-up approach due to cultural aspect and so on. So that's my humble addition.
All right, thank you very much. Sharri, would you like to address Jasmine's comment on the British obsession with the contribution of railway in colonial India and the idea that is presented as under mask of development and positive investment?
I love this question, actually, because it is a very key part of what I've been thinking about with this project. I'm also besides looking at the railway, I'm looking at all these different infrastructural elements, and especially port infrastructure and maritime infrastructure. And all of those ideas of causeways and corridors are like an essential part of how colonial conquest actually operated it. And the railroad was, railroad colonialism is an essential part of how these different kind of global relationships were kind of connecting to each other in these like disconnected ways that the corridors that I'm talking about are operating in. But then this other thing about how it's shielded through the language of development, through and in very neutral language of development, positivist, civilization or like civilizing missions, and the idea that these advancements are necessary, like all of that is super familiar. And that's why when I think about how one day I'll write these stories, it's with like, you know, these bookends of tales of two trains, the one of 1905 and the kind of how I would situate that in what was happening as kind of a railroad colonialism idea, and how it's operating in the present. And the other piece of that, of course, in the present, and it kind of links a little bit with Javier's project, or not a lot with Javier's project, is that language of the smart. You know, the smart AI port, the idea of technologies that are operating somehow disentangled from the political geography, and also that it is a necessary and inevitable future and will help everyone and be, of course, completely neutral in politics. Which, yeah, so I love, thanks, Yasmin. I would love to actually talk to you more about that in, you know, off this panel. And then if I can't help also wanting to respond a little bit to the other question, and just that, you know, kind of picking up on what Essie said, is like, it is actually really important to think about this as operating not as at state level. You know, we tend, especially like when you have so little time at a conference, like, you know, we tend to just be talking about these entity of state. And obviously we aren't talking about entities of state. We're talking about multiple agents and interlocutors at public, private, civilian, military, international organizations, and all these other kind of standardized connections that actually break this down into something that is happening in a crazy material way. And fitting in new ways of thinking about kind of settler colonialism, neoliberalism, and the way they kind of make each other much more rigorous. And the last thing I want to say about that is just in like even a few days ago, you saw like this public announcement about 2 private corporations in Israel and 2 private corporations in the UAE are going to now build cooperation around cures for COVID. You know, like, and this kind of, and we should really be thinking about how what's going on right now is absolutely going to push these projects forward.
All right, thank you very much. I'm really sorry, we've got 2 or 3 questions that we just were not able to tackle. I'm really sorry. I hope the panelists are happy to be contacted in case by the members of the audience via email or because they're really interesting questions, just it's not enough time. Just a couple of reminders before we finish. So first of all, we have a panel starting at 4:30 on regional powers. Regional powers number 2, the return. And it's our Olivia Golombitsa chairing it. And I also really want to thank, take this occasion to thank our 3 fantastic CEPAD young scholars, Elias Ghazal, Ayada Refai, and Olivia Golombitsa, that have been doing all of the hard work for the conference, and it has really been a lot of work, and it would have not been possible without the 3 of them. So thank you very much, guys. And also a massive thank you to my co-organizers, sorry, Jasmine Ghani, Chris Phillips, Eddie Wasnage, and Simon Maben. Am I forgetting someone? No, I think that's everybody. All right. Just to conclude, thank you very much to the speakers. It was a fascinating panel.